As the election gets closer, the economy is really not doing too well, and some would say it's on the brink. 8 million people, 8 million, have slipped into poverty since May, when federal aid dried up in the coronavirus pandemic. That number is from Columbia University. And there's another number, 6 million people within the past 3 months have slipped into poverty. This is from University of Chicago and Notre Dame. Now, on top of that, we just had 898,000 layoffs this month. What everybody needs to understand is, in the history of record keeping for this, the previous record was about 800,000 jobs lost in a single month. This was back during the subprime mortgage crisis and the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, in that area. Now it is a very common thing that we have these colossal swings. Yes, there have been recent jobs reports where we gained 500,000 or a million or whatever it was. But a lot of that was due to the stimulus, which is now pretty much done. The impacts of it are done. And so we're defaulting right back to COVID pandemic depression economy. And yet again, we casually destroyed the old record of number of jobs lost. 898,000 just this month. Now, beyond that, look at this. Census survey data shows 32% of people nationwide think they are very or somewhat likely to face eviction in the next 2 months. That number spikes to more than half of those surveyed in North Carolina and Wyoming, and nearly half of all surveyed in Nevada. 32% of people nationwide very or somewhat likely to face eviction in the next month. And they haven't gotten a stimulus agreement. They haven't made a stimulus deal. And we've talked about the specifics of it. There's a $1.8 trillion deal on the table from Trump and Mnuchin. It's not a bad deal. Nancy has rejected it, but even if Nancy accepted it, Mitch McConnell would reject it. In other words, the American people are being left out to dry. It is a terrifying thought when you ponder on what could happen within the next 3 months, 4 months, year. Because we're already seeing the rumblings in the Republican Senate caucus that they're already starting to talk about austerity. And they don't want any more stimulus. And they're already using the arguments because they expect Trump to lose. That's the open secret among elected Republicans. They expect Trump to lose. And so if/when Biden gets in power, up front, they want to kneecap any argument for more help for the American people. And so we have coronavirus still ripping through the country. Over 215,000 Americans dead. That number's rising. We're at another new peak because the weather's getting cold again in the fall. And it's going to get worse as time goes by. People are losing their jobs. People who have jobs have taken pay cuts. There's no real plan to address COVID substantively. And we have this as well. 32% of people might get evicted. Now, there are some eviction protections in some states and federally, but there are loopholes that you could drive a Mack truck through, and we've discussed them on the show previously. A lot of people don't even know about if they're protected from eviction. And so we're about to see a crisis the likes of which we really haven't seen since the Great Depression. I mean, I would argue we're already kind of in that crisis, but it's about to get a hell of a lot worse. There was one number I read a few months ago. Right now in the country, we have about 500,000 homeless people. we could see up to 28 million homeless people. 28 million. I mean, before COVID, we were already living in a country where half of workers made $30,000 a year or less. That was before COVID. 78% of workers were living paycheck to paycheck. Before COVID. Now, it's getting worse, and Washington is slamming on the brakes. It looks like you're not going to get a stimulus deal before the election. I hope that changes, but I doubt it. And now, after Biden gets elected, that's why the Republicans are already starting to ease into the austerity arguments. So what they're going to do is, when Biden and the Democrats are like, we got to do something, the Republicans are going to go, would you look at this debt and this deficit? It is so high, we can't afford to do anything else. Notice, nobody said a word. Nobody said a word about the debt or the deficit when the CARES Act was giving $5 trillion to corporations. Nobody said a word about the deficit when Trump's own tax cuts added $1.7 trillion to the deficit. Nobody said a word. Nobody said a word, and those were tax cuts for the wealthy by and large. Nobody said a word. Nobody said a word when we continued the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Nobody said a word about the debt and the deficit. They're only going to trot it out now because they don't want to do stimulus for the American people. They don't want to cut a check to the American people. And again, Nancy Pelosi's not blameless because she's not signing on to the $1.8 trillion deal either. And she keeps changing her reason as to why. But even if she did accept it, McConnell would block it. So they are going to sit around while the country burns, while people are going through immense pain and suffering and degradation and desperation. They're just going to sit around. I know I say this quite a bit, but I'm going to say it again because it's a real eye-opening experience. It'll snap a lot of people out of it. Go read Reddit unemployment and tell me it doesn't change your entire outlook on the world. I don't care. If you go into reading that and you fancy yourself a fiscal conservative, you'll come out of it saying, I'm an idiot. I don't know why I would ever. Like, obviously, we should prioritize helping these people pretty much above everything else. Like, what is a government for if not to be that safety net of last resort? What's a government for? What's a government for? The immense pain that's out there. Just like I always say to people, and somebody else had said this to me too, and I think it's true. If you read any of Chomsky's books on foreign policy, you could go into the book being, like a wishy-washy centrist, perceive yourself that way, and you'll come out of the book saying, "Oh my God, I'm a hardcore anti-imperialist. This is crazy," because it reminds you and tells you stuff you didn't know, and when you learn it, there's no going back about the way the U.S. acts around the world with our foreign policy. Now we're in a similar situation, but if you read Reddit unemployment and you think about the way the economy works, you'll be like, oh my God, it's even worse than I thought. And we need to do something, and we need to do it now. I always say it's Medicare for All and UBI is where you have to start. If you do Medicare for All and UBI, that alone would solve so many problems and save so many lives, cut so much poverty. That's where you start, and then we work off of that, but we can't even get another measly $1,200 check to people. Again, I shudder at the thought of, as time goes by, how bad is it really going to get?